Hi, everyone. Good to have you all who are here live and excited for whoever is going to be watching the recording later. I've turned on closed captioning. And so if you happen to see it on your end and it doesn't serve you, feel free to turn that off on your side with the closed captioning. We'll get started with some meditation, some orienting, just some grounding to allow us to arrive into the space and transition from wherever we've been so far this morning. So I invite you into a shape that you can be in for a couple of minutes. I think about a shape that is supportive for you. So that might be lying down, that might be sitting, that might be standing. And I invite you to just start to use your senses to arrive. Maybe that means just feeling where your body makes contact with the earth or the wall or the chair or the bed. Maybe checking out your posture. Maybe you want to lengthen that spine a bit. Maybe you want to soften that spine a bit. Maybe you want to move those shoulders, wrists, neck and head around a bit, just creating a bit more space, a little bit more in your body. Just this slowing down and tuning in. Feeling the air touching your skin, feeling the temperature in the room. Taking in the sounds around you. How those sounds or how those smells or how your body is reacting to all of that. And the chatter of the mind as we go through all of our senses. Taking in the taste in your mouth. The rhythm of your heartbeat. The rhythm of your breath. An awareness of the emotions and the energy, the attitude you're bringing into this virtual space. And I invite you to go on a journey with me, to think about how you've been conditioned and all the things, well, maybe not all the things, because we don't have time for that, but think about the highlights of your life that help condition you and bring you to who you are in this moment. So inviting you to go inside a bit more and think about yourself and all the identities that make you, you. And of all those identities, I want you to center yourself as a racial being. Because we can't really talk about critical race theory without centering ourselves as racial beings and seeing the world from a lens of race. So some of us think about ourselves as racial beings every day, maybe every moment of our lives. And some of us, not so much. So I invite you to think about how you have been conditioned to be or not be a racial being from the moment you were born. it probably actually started before you were born, because you came from ancestors and they were conditioned to be racial beings or not. So I invite you to think about your parents or what you know of them, and their parents and their parents and their parents. How far back can you go? Or were there stories about being racial beings? How did they come to be in the United States? Thinking about their relationship to the indigenous people, the lands we inhabit. And what time period were you born into? What stressors might your parent have had leading up to your birth? What kind of care may they have received? And how were you welcomed into the world? Who took care of you? Who was in your family? Who did you go on play dates with? Who was in your neighborhood? I want you to think about in elementary school having these class pictures. And if you could bring up an image of one of those years, it's like, who were the racial beings in your class? Did you grow up in a neighborhood that people pretty much looked like you? Or was there a range of skin colors and racial identities and ethnicities? Who did your family have close relationships to, and what were the conversations around race? What were some of the big things of that decade happening in the news? Was race something that your family talked about? Or was colorblindness more encouraged? And as you kept going through school, did it change? What happened after high school? If you compare where you started, which was more your parents' choice, and where you are now, what choices have you made around who you have intimate relationships with? Where you went to school, where you're working, where you're living? How do you talk about being a racial being with your circle of influence? I invite you to check out your body and how is it talking to you as you go through your timeline. This idea of race being part of the air that we breathe. And so throughout my time together with you today, I invite you to keep dropping into your body and noticing what it's reacting to, and to try to be friends with whatever arises. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll try to answer as many questions or clarify things as much towards the end. So inviting in a spirit of curiosity. It's been so interesting to see how much we've seen people really be polarized around this topic of critical race theory. So in our meditation, I invited you to think about how you were conditioned to be a racial being. And maybe you want to go back to that meditation and spend some more time with that. When we think about how we've been socialized as racial beings, we start at the individual level and our family, our social network, our intimate network. And then we can expand to community, and then to various institutions. And then what are the social norms and historical forces that are happening, that have been happening, that we're a byproduct of, and then kind of like the vast spirit and landscape. And so the thing is, the closer we are to the individual level, the more maybe it's easier to bring that to conscious awareness. Like it's easier to think, oh, I grew up in a segregated neighborhood, or I'm choosing now to live in a segregated neighborhood. It's easier to think about what your family did or didn't do, and maybe talk about what happens in the community. It gets harder as we go further away from the center of the concentric circles. It gets harder to think about, like, how does race as a construct, as a social construct, how does it get embedded in our institutions? How are the historical forces of the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, how do they show up in 2022? You know, what's our relationship to the land and to the greater vast universe? All of that stuff. But the thing is that our bodies are holding that history. If you believe in some of that epigenetics of stuff translating down through the generations. So we can also think about this as where have we been influenced, but also where we have the potential to influence others and institutions and history. I've been thinking a lot more in recent years about my ancestors, those known to me and those not known to me, how they shaped me, and how I want to be a good ancestor. And so I invite you to think about, how do you want to be as an ancestor? How do you want to be remembered? And what do you want to do to work towards collective liberation? Because that's what I'm about these days, is working towards collective liberation. So if we look at these different systems, these are also ways in which oppression can happen. And maybe that word oppression might make a little bit more sense towards the end of this chat. So some of you know me, some of you don't. So I'll just say a little bit about who I am and my social locations, because I think that's important when we're talking about anything related to looking at systems of privilege and systems of oppression. And so orienting to this wheel of power and privilege, it's just saying there are lots of different identities in this world. We're centering race in this conversation, but we don't show up in any space as just one identity. And some people would say that when we look at different identities, there are some identities that are viewed as more privileged and have more institutional power. So meaning they have more ability to influence the reality that's told, to influence decision-making, to decide who's valuable, who's not, which bodies are more important, which identities are more important. And they're kind of more like a lot of our standards and norms are built culturally around those identities that are closer to the center of this wheel of power and privilege. So I come to you from central New Jersey, the land of the Lenni Lenape. I identify as Black and more specifically Haitian American. Both my parents were born and raised in Haiti and came here as young adults to the very urban Brooklyn, New York, and kind of lived the American dream of learning the language and becoming professionals and having 2 children and moving to the very white suburbs of central New Jersey when I was in elementary school. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, 500-hour trained yoga teacher, able-bodied, heterosexually passing, married to a white cis man in a heteronormative relationship, so I identify more as queer, bi, pansexual, neurotypical, raising 2 kids who are neurodiverse, robust in terms of mental health, larger body size, own property with my spouse, middle, upper middle class, came from parents who started in the poor class and moved themselves up to middle, upper middle class. I came from both parents who worked and who were married during my upbringing. English is my predominant language, though it wasn't my my primary language in the beginning. Cisgender female, having a sibling who identifies more as non-binary or gender expansive, US citizen, in my mid-40s, raised Roman Catholic, and have been kind of a Unitarian Universalist for the last 15 years, and incorporate a lot of kind of Eastern religion into my daily life. So that gives you a sense of who I am and the lens in which I view the world. And I feel like I'm really informed these days by a lot of Black Buddhist teachers, a lot of Black feminist abolitionists, and so many amazing anti-racist people out there in this world. So I invite you to think about your own social locations and how they frame how you view the world. So in Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi talks about how we have a story about racism and how we think about racial disparities impacts how we proceed. So there's kind of like three camps. Those who believe that racial disparities are due to biological differences, and mainly the fact that kind of like the white body is superior and all other bodies, the global majority, are inferior. And that's just biologically driven. And then there are assimilationists who believe that we could explain most racial disparities, like maybe why some people are incarcerated more, some people have more wealth than others. It's strictly due to behaviors. And so if we work on behavioral change, then the racial disparities will decrease. And it's really on the individuals to change their behaviors. And then there's this other camp that's kind of this anti-racist camp, or abolitionist camp, that would say that that it's actually not really so much biology. It's not solely behaviors, that it's in the roots, it's in the system, it's in the air that we breathe. It was constructed this way for there to be these racial disparities from the very beginning. So the system isn't broken, it's operating the way that it was designed to operate from the very beginning. And the very beginning, being even prior to the United States being officially the United States. So I want you to think about that for yourself. Which camp are you in? And your circle of influence and the people you associate with, which camp are they in? And my guess would be that most people are in the middle, right? This is assimilationist. So let's talk about how racism shows up, right? Many of us think of racism as individual acts of bigotry, individual acts of discrimination. And that's true. And we can also think about racism in terms of the way that it is systemic, the way that it's built into our institutions. And so if we think about what are institutions in the United States? There's institutions like education, the legal system, the healthcare system. We can think of many different areas where institutions happen. And then we can think of different organizations. And so what are the policies? What are the practices that are embedded in those institutions that might have some racial disparities built into it? And then we think about what are some of the cultural ways that racism gets exhibited? So beliefs, values, norms, right? And some questions to kind of critically think is, how are white people included in this policy, or included or represented in a particular light in the show or in this article? How are white people served? How are they financially resourced by this bill being passed? How are they uplifted or validated? And the flip side would be to ask, how are Black, Indigenous, people of color, I'll say BIPOC, how are they excluded? How are they underserved? How are they financially exploited? How are they oppressed or invalidated by this article, this show, this policy, this law? And so those are some of the questions to start to ask, because once you start to ask those questions, I think of it as like building a muscle. You start to see that not many things are actually colorblind. So, critical race theory. So, critical race theory started in the 70s. It actually, I think about Derek Bell, who wrote Faces at the Bottom of the Well in 1992, who was one of the early critical race theorists, and he was a lawyer and a civil rights activist, and he was really looking at, after the civil rights movement of the 60s, he was trying to understand, why are things not progressing really for people of color, particularly Black people? And so they started to look at, like, what are some of the disparities that are happening? Because even though these laws have been passed, there's slow progress in trying to decrease the gap, the disparities. And so they really were looking at Brown versus Board of Education, and what were things like before Brown versus Board Education, and then after that, when there was more integration of schools. And so it was really for a long time taught in law school. And one of the hallmark things about critical race theory is that it says that racism is more than individual acts of prejudice and bigotry. It's much bigger than that. That it's really in the air that we breathe. It's embedded in all of our systems, institutions, and structures. It's part of our history, and we can't improve things without addressing inequities created by systemic racism for over 400 or 500 years. I mean, if we think about United States history, it starts with genocide of the indigenous people, and then it continues on with the colonists taking over the land, and then the first official slave ships in 1619. And then we have 246 years of chattel slavery and a lot of anti-Black laws. And then after the abolishment of slavery, we have 100 years of Black codes and Jim Crow laws. And then we have the civil rights. So we've only had 50 or 60 years of post-civil rights time, which is not a whole lot of time to eradicate 400 or 500 years of either thinking there are biological differences between white people and non-white people, the global majority, or that there are behavioral differences, right? And so critical race theory is we have to own that history. And then the kind of more modern day critical race theory scholars are Kimberly Crenshaw, who's also known for coining intersectionality, and that racism looks different across time and generations. So if we're looking in 2022 for racism to look like it did in the 1940s or 1950s, yeah, I'm sure there's some of that, but it's changed, right? Mass incarceration would be or the war on drugs, which led to the mass incarceration, would be a great example of present day, one example of present day racism. So when we think about, so what does this mean? It means that racism is ordinary. It's not an aberration. It's normal. It's the air we breathe. It's not the exception. It's part of our everyday life. It just, maybe we haven't learned how to see what it looks like in our communities, in our school district, in our organizations, in our judicial system. Or some people see it and some other people don't. The reality, and I think this is the part that really gets people fired up, because I think people will own that, yeah, there were 246 years of chattel slavery. Yeah, there were 100 years of Jim Crow. Yeah, there was a lynching. I think people would honor that about history, most people. But I think this thing about the idea that white people benefit from racism continuing in present day, and they always have benefited from it. Even if we think about the US being a world power and it being wealthy and how many people want to immigrate to the United States, it's built on the backs of the indigenous people and the enslaved Black people. So this idea that white people benefit from racism, and that depending on what social economic class you are, you might benefit from racism differently, right? If you're wealthy, you benefit from it differently than if you're working class white person. But nonetheless, white people have an advantage, have a little bit of an ease, or if they're still struggling and suffering, it's not related to race, it's related to something else. And because white people as a collective, right? I think sometimes when we're talking about like a whole group of people, I think it's meant to talk about a collective which challenges our culture of individualism. So white people don't have a whole lot of incentive to fight racism. Because even if they're experiencing or noticing some of the harm that's happening to communities of color and individuals who identify as BIPOC and present as BIPOC in their daily life, maybe they don't feel the effects. And so there isn't a whole lot of energy or incentive to dismantle the forces of racism, sometimes to even see it. So critical race theory also says that race is a social construction. And at the same time, that social construction has a lot of weight, a lot of power. And that social construction continues to be based on this idea of the white body being the supreme body. Whether you think that's biologically driven, whether you think that's intellect, whether you think it's behavior, and that the global majority, all other people, are viewed as inferior in some way. And that the idea is that throughout history, the people in power, like the white elite, they get to define reality. They get to define whose bodies are viewed as more profitable or just viewed as better for whatever reason. And that if we look at different racial or ethnic groups, at different times they've been encouraged to immigrate. At different times they've been highlighted and meant to fear. And we could see that at different times in history. We could look at Japanese Americans in World War II and put into camps in the United States. We can look at when people immigrating from Hispanic or Latinx countries are invited and when they're not, when different racial groups are allowed to come versus others. We're looking at Middle Eastern Muslims after 9/11, the way that they were targeted and meant to be feared. Or we look at Asian Americans during the pandemic. So this idea of like othering some group of people at some point in time. And this idea that we don't show up in spaces as just one identity. We show up as many identities. And it's hard to talk about a whole group of people as monolithic, right? So not all Black people, not all African American, not all Africans are the same, right? And so we could say that about any racial group. And that when we have multiple identities, you know, for some people, their racial identity is primary, and for others, it's gender or religion or neurodiversity or sexual orientation. And so how do we keep that in mind, that it's really complicated and we can't simplify it? And that my issues or the ways in which I'm buffered by racism in some ways because of my other identities, that matters, that's important, right? And that middle-class Black people perhaps have different experiences and overlapping experiences with working class Black people. And so how do we keep that in mind? Same thing with you know, white elites versus working class white people. So how do we keep that in mind? And this idea that we are all prejudiced, right? We all have biases, conscious or unconscious. And some of us have power as individuals in our roles, in the resources we have available to us, or institutionally we're represented, that we're able to take our prejudice and act on that prejudice. And so there's kind of a psychology to those who do the oppressing and those who are oppressed. And that this is happening over all time and spaces, this intersection of those who are doing the oppressing and those who are oppressed. And that's just normal everyday life. There's nothing exceptional about that. So if we think about the cycle of oppression, going back to our opening meditation, is that this cycle of oppression begins before we're born. Or to put it in a different way, right, is that one of the statistics out there is that Black women die at higher rates related to pregnancy than other racial groups in the United States, even when you control for class. And so you would ask yourself, is that due to biology? Is that due to behavior? Or is that the system, the infrastructure, the bias that's already built into the system that we're all operating in and participating in some way, unless we're deliberately trying to disrupt it? And then which babies are more vulnerable than others? And then how are they received by their families and all those institutions? Who helps to raise them and condition them and tell them who they are? Who has to be socialized as a racial being and others get to be colorblind? And why do those parents teach them to be racial beings? Is it a way to survive because they understand that the system and the cycle of oppression continues? It just looks different generation to generation. Thinking about like the books I grew up with and what did my dolls look like, and who did I get to see represented in particular ways, who was more invisible. And when I went to predominantly BIPOC schools versus predominantly white schools, what was the different experience of that? What did I internalize that was anti-Blackness? And then how does that get reinforced over and over and over again? And then how do we bring it on to the next generation? So that cycle of oppression is going on all the time in all those interlocking systems. So I think the power of this systemic racism and how it moves from generation to generation is really powerful. I'm going to stop the recording shortly just to show you this video that you can access on YouTube. It's called Unequal Opportunity Race. And I want you to think about, if we're all operating in this system and we're looking through the lens of critical race theory, how does gender intersect with race? And even though this video is kind of binary in terms of gender, and it only represents two different races, we could imagine if there were more lanes in this race, what other racial or ethnic groups, where they would be in the race, what other gender identities beyond this binary notion, where they would be in the race, if we look at the intersection of race with these other identities. All right, so when we think about that recording, and that you just check back in with your body and thinking about where you are on that race and what makes things easier or harder for you, and noticing like what maybe you had a hard time with or what was familiar with it, but also thinking about how affirmative action is just one strategy to try to combat racial disparities, right? Whether you believe in affirmative action or not, right? It's more about, can we see what some people are saying are the fundamental problems, even if we don't agree with how to address how they should be solved. So I think about Dr. Annalise Singh, and she wrote this thing from the Racial Healing Handbook, where she talks about racial harm. And she highlights that we all need to heal from racial harm. And when I think about anti-racism work, right? So if you understand critical race theory, you understand some of the components about it, right? Then you start to ask, instead of saying, am I racist? Are you racist? Is there racism here? It's more about, how does racism show up in this place? How are white bodies centered or valued, or their comfort or their gaze is prioritized over others, right? We're talking about whether or not critical race theory should be taught in school. What are people actually talking about, right? Are we going to learn the actual events that happened? Are we going to own that harm was done to a group of people and they're still experiencing some of those effects in present day? So what are we actually opposed to, and whose comfort are we prioritizing over, and who would maybe feel validated by a different set of facts being told about history? So thinking about, right, this idea that we've all been conditioned by the forces of racism, and that there's probably only a few groups, a small percentage of people who are overtly racist. Like on a conscious level, they have racist beliefs. And that most people are conditioned by the forces of racism, have internalized some of that, and are just operating in the air that we're all breathing, right? And some of us can see it more clearly than others. Some of us have more proximity to it than others. Some of us are more motivated to look at, how is racism showing up in this space? How is white body supremacy showing up in this space? So when we think about like ways to heal, right, is we have to learn or relearn the history of racism in this country. We can't heal something that we can't even name, that we can't even see. We have to grieve for all the harm that's been done and the ways in which we've been harmed, or the ways we've harmed others, just by being disconnected or cut off or segregated, or the lives we've lost, the people who matter to us, who we can't be in relationship with anymore. We have to raise our race consciousness, meaning seeing ourselves as racial beings, seeing everyone as racial beings and how they've been conditioned. Right? We're living in a time where color blindness is not what is being asked for. We have to catch ourselves in the flow of racism, because we start to see that it's there more times than not. How do we start to understand racism and how it shows up in relationships? If we are in a more privileged group, so if we're talking about race, if you are white or white presenting, what is your responsibility in naming race in conversations, in making it ordinary and part of conversations to talk about race, and to show that you are not fragile, that you don't have to be defensive, that you're doing your own work, that you want to be part of the solution, right? That you didn't cause all of it, and yet you want to be part of being responsible for solving it for this generation and the generations to come. So how do I see how racism shows up in relationships, right? I think about, I don't know what the exact stats are, but that the United States as a whole, right, still highly segregated, and that people have very few like intimate relationships with people who are racially different from them. And then oftentimes, even when they do have close relationships with people who are racially different than them, they're not having meaningful conversations about being racial beings. So how do we get more comfortable about talking about ourselves as racial beings? And do it in a way that leaves room for everyone to participate in that, and build trust to be able to do that, given the history of harm that has happened as a white collective towards Black and Brown people. How do you reclaim your whole racial self, right? Whether you're multiracial, whether they're parts of your identity or your lineage or your immigration history that you haven't dealt with, haven't healed from. How do you become a racial ally? So you have the intellectual knowledge, maybe you're more embodied, maybe you're more integrated, but then how does it translate into action, into your everyday life? And then how do you move beyond just individual stuff towards collective healing, towards engaging your circle of influence, right? And it goes back to seeing yourself as a racial being and seeing how other people see you as a racial being, and exploring how you have internalized racism. because we all have internalized racism. And for some of us, that makes us have shame or not good enough or not speak out. And others, it causes us to discriminate, to dominate, to harm, to segregate ourselves, all of that stuff. So how do we heal all of those things? And knowing maybe you can't do it all at once, but what part of the slice of pie are you working on now? So my last slide is this idea of like, how do we create conditions for holding change? From healing, right? I hear we're living in, we haven't been this polarized as a nation since the Civil War, probably because we haven't dealt with the underlying mechanisms and attitudes that drove the Civil War. All of that stuff that went underground has been rising to the surface. So how do we hold both ands? How do we hold nuanced conversations? How do you go forth and bring some of this into your conversations in the days to come? How do you notice your social location in conversations? Notice what power is at work in the room. I was in a new board meeting yesterday. I was the only, to me, apparent person of color in that room. It was my first time being in this board meeting. And I think I said almost nothing, except when I was asked a direct question. And it was the first time in a long time I had been in a predominantly white space, probably where I wasn't the facilitator. And to see again that mechanism, right? Really, apparently nice people. I didn't know them that well. But this idea of like, how is power showing up in this room? Who has ease to talk? Who doesn't? Like, what's the style of communicating and just the energy in the room? Like, how do we start to pay attention to this and maybe start to work on how do we become more inclusive, or how do we start to notice why might some people be dominating the conversation more than others, right? And how much of it is our own stuff we have to work on, and how much of it is like part of what the group dynamic is. How do we honor differences, right? And different experiences, and not try to convince people of things? How do we get consent to have conversations about racism so that people are prepared and ready to talk about that stuff? So perhaps they show up as their best, more curious self, but also to not shy away from conflict and to disrupt silence, to make it visible, to invite in compassion and accountability, right? That we want to not try to dehumanize people. We've all been socialized by the forces of racism. We want to create culture of inclusion and name harms as they happen in the moment. How do we build that muscle? Even if we don't have the vocabulary, but maybe the body is telling you, your feeling sense is telling you. How do you listen for understanding rather than trying to convince people of something, or like preparing your response? Work towards doing less harm rather than doing more good, right? That sometimes our good intentions cause a lot of harm. So let's work towards doing less harm, which means we have to see ourselves as racial beings and do that power analysis. How do we bring love and compassion into these conversations, responding versus reacting, which means we need to be in a settled body, right? What allows you to resource, to ground, even if you feel rage or grief? And how do we center the most marginalized voices in the room? And know that oftentimes these conversations, we leave with more questions than answers. It's messy, and it has to be an ongoing action and conversation. And how do you balance like learning and being aware and educating yourself with building bridges, building communities, moving towards action? So I hope that you will take some of this forward. I'd love to hear from you how you're digesting it and questions you may have, and support you on the journey. So I'm going to stop the recording